very much for inviting me. I do appreciate that. I think your organisation is inspirational as the Ludwig von Mises Institute, your co-hosts, and I'm very grateful to be here. I've been asked to talk on my experiences as an entrepreneur in the Meltdown. I've called it the Meltdown of 2008. So my business, I supply largely fish, 93% fish, 7% meat, to hotels, restaurants, supermarkets across the United Kingdom. So we're in the food sector, certainly all our restaurant exposures. Sorry, is there a problem with the sound? No? You're right. Certainly with our restaurants, we're at the very discretionary end of expenditure, and we've known for a long time, because being an Austrian economist, I'm aware of the Austrian theory of the business cycle, which is a very useful thing to always have in the back of your mind when you're building a business. But we've known for a long time that a lot of our activities, and indeed our customers' activities, have been polluted by what I call bubble activity created by the central banks, by loose money, and I think, you know, all of you will be very familiar with the story, but I'll show you one little bit of applied Austrian economics that I use to help myself through the recession. Is up here you see there's a graph of the what I call actual money supply, which is a very bold name to call this. This is, you could call it actual money supply or Austrian money supply. Ludwig von Mises, the great teacher of perhaps many of us, taught us to distinguish between a claim transaction and a credit transaction. He also taught us, following Karl Menger, that money is the final thing for which all goods exchange. Now, following that, you can build up your concept of a money supply and be fairly confident that you're accurate if you can distinguish between a claim transaction and a credit transaction. And I'd just like to show you the contrast between what the mainstream tell us about what is money. You can see this is the United Kingdom. We have two accepted measures, M0 and M4. M0 is notes and coins, less government deposits, and M4 is that plus a whole concoction of other monetary measures, including claim transactions, largely savings deposits, and various other things. Now, if you look at the blue line, that's the M0. It kind of just chugs along from 1998 at the start of the graph to 2009. I don't think it really tells us much about the economy. If you look at the grey line, starting in 1998, it kind of meanders along. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger as the monetary base grows, but it's not really telling us much about the economy. Actual money supply, or Austrian money supply, is the red line there. And I'd just like to draw your attention to 1998 at the beginning of the graph there. In 1998, some of you may remember long-term capital management, and I think it was a 4 billion bailout, which at the time was, just a ginormous, horrendous figure of money to consider. But now it's not even loose change for our central bankers now. But that's when you see the actual money supply first of all decline. You then see the massive, ginormous bailout that happened, or bailout. I'm using a word of the late 2000s now, but the massive dot-com bubble being created in the run-up to 2000, and then we see the steady decline to 2003, when certainly our bank, different to the Federal Reserve was taking a different tact at the time, but the Bank of England was tightening the monetary base. And in around 2003, we had some shocks in the economy. There was a little correction. It started pumping up again, and then bingo there, June 2008, we start seeing the effect of the global meltdown that we see now, right down to here, and then we see the massive pumping of money that's happened since, which has lifted up our stock exchange. The FTSE share index is now over 5,000. It's had a 42% rise since March of this year, but anyone who participates in business activity in the United Kingdom will know we've certainly not had a 42% increase in our balance sheet net worth or in our profit and loss accounts or in anything. It's purely a function of liquidity. Unfortunately, the stock exchange, if your stockbroker tells you he understands companies and he's got some great insights into how these things work, I would counsel caution and always point to measures like this, which you see here, the Austrian money supply, which is telling me that liquidity is causing the nice, happy, warm, comforting feeling that we're feeling now in the UK economy. So, in my business, I've always been aware that the bust will come. I've got to say, no way on earth did I ever anticipate the severity of the bust. Let me just show you some other correlations. This is actually a correlation with FTSE, the Financial Times ordinary share index of the 100 highest market capitalized companies. There's a correlation. It's not wonderful, but you can see here how in the final analysis where we've had the red line, our uptick of liquidity. So here you can see how liquidity, the blue line is the FTSE index and the red line is the current monetary pumping of the Bank of England, and there's a good correlation. This is one of my favourite correlations, retail sales. As you can see, our red line on retail sales, watching the money supply, correlates almost exactly with the blue line, retail sales. And that's the correlation with GDP. So the Austrian school, or applied Austrian economics, which very few of us do, I can only think of probably 3 or 4 practitioners in the world who apply Austrian economics to major indices and trying to get an understanding in the mainstream world, if you like, can be very, very useful. And that's why in my business I've always been very cautious in terms of how we've planned our business. But during this process, I think another insight that the Austrian theory of the business cycle has given me is that during the time of the boom and the massive monetary pumping that we've seen a new class of entrepreneurs, or Jesus Huerto de Soto quite correctly pointed out to me, and I bow to his superior knowledge on this, that an entrepreneur is a pure form, and I shouldn't call anyone a sub-entrepreneur or a marginal entrepreneur, because of course that can't be the case. So I'll call them pseudo-entrepreneurs, if that would be acceptable to the great man over there. He nods his head, so I'm very glad about that. So the pseudo-entrepreneur came into existence in a major way during the dot-com boom. I think we can all relate to that. We can all see how banks, when they're presented with extra reserves at the central bank, they need to lend out that money. And how they lend out that money, if you've gone through your checklist as a banker of all the best investment cases, you choose those investments first. What are you going to do with this extra money? Well, you go to your next most marginal deal, and so on and so forth. And the problem with this central bank monetary pumping that we have is that the suboptimal or pseudo-entrepreneur comes into existence in force, someone who should really remain employed in their current job, but they fancy the life of an entrepreneur, and they borrow the money. A boom seemingly comes into existence, and then we're followed when it can't be sustained anymore. So the monetary pumping can't go on forever because you become inflationary. Then the whole house of cards falls down. So the Austrian theory of the business cycle, again, if you introduce that concept of heterogeneity into the entrepreneur, as opposed to just treating him as a blob or one class, can be a very useful tool. And I think, if I remember correctly, the Juan de Mariana Institute is doing a study of entrepreneurship to really understand the negative effects of bubble activity on entrepreneurship. Anyway, so I, like many of us in this room, have been aware of what would happen in the financial meltdown. In the UK, we started our financial meltdown in August 2007. August 2007 was the Run on the Rock. I don't know whether any of you know the Northern Rock Building Society, but all of a sudden, it was a bit like the Mary Poppins film. I don't know whether you remember the Mary Poppins film where the boy asked for his, is it a pence or one penny or tuppence? He asked for his tuppence, and that was it. That was enough to put the whole bank out of business. Well, that happened spectacularly with the Northern Rock Building Society in August 2007. The government eventually did bail it out. It was a building society that its chairman is a gentleman called Matt Ridley, who writes quite good books on genetics, but he was certainly not a banker. And in his annual report, I remember reading a comment that his liquidity had gone down to such small fractional. His reserves had gone down to such a tiny fraction of his actual lending that he was proud to announce that he was going to try and move it down to zero by the time the next annual report was written, and then the rest is history. It went bust. But it was very interesting, from that period from 2007 August to Lehman's, which was September 2008. I described that period in business as the Phoney War. This is the Phoney War. I'm using an analogy from 1939 to 1940, when World War II really got going in England. In England, war was announced in 1939. People listened to it on the radio. They went on and played cricket, and then all of a sudden, the bombs started, falling 8 months later, and that's how it felt in business. We were sitting there, knowing that something was going to happen, but knowing not what it was or to what extent it could be. Then, by the time we've seen a few American banks go bust. We saw people getting very, very nervous. I was getting considerably nervous as well. And then Lehman's happened at 7:58 on September the 15th in the morning. Lehman's were one of my customers, and I just remember watching on the turnover statistics. It's good spend a day, every day, very consistent, and then suddenly nothing, bang, it had gone bust. And at that point in time, I've got to say I've never experienced anything quite so surreal as and panic. The panic in the eyes of the average businessman, as we all collectively fell off the cliff, and we did. And every single person in business fell off the edge of the cliff. And I think we were still falling, not being able to project, not being able to forecast or predict anything, really until about November of that year. And in November of that year, it seemed like we hit terra firma, and one could start reforecasting and replanning in the business, which was the start of the correction, if you like, for me, November 2008. But during that period, some of you may be aware of the Iceland issues there. Iceland had I think it had its bank's balance sheets were 10 times bigger than its country's GDP. Now, we all say that's shock horror, but I think if you look at America, I wouldn't think, it's probably 4 or 5. Certainly if you look at Switzerland, I think it's 8 or 9. If you look in GB, where I'm from, I think it was 6. So not a big number, but not that different to us. 15% of my raw material comes from Iceland, from their cod fishery and from their haddock fishery. And we were trading away, and I think it was about October the 6th or 7th, their first bank went, and within a week, there was no currency at all in that country. So I had fishermen landing with maybe £250,000 worth of fish in their hull. They've been out for 10 days at sea, and they're not being able to transact. You imagine that, not being able to actually physically sell your goods because you have no currency. You can't transact in it. That country was reduced to barter, That country was reduced to barter for about 2 weeks. And during that period of time, we had to rely on trust, and I mean trust, just blind trust from people who we traded with for years and years and years to send us product, and we would remunerate them in either euros or in dollars or sterling or some currency that they would accept. But we couldn't get it into the country because we weren't allowed. There's no method. I've got this great email, by the way, from the Central Bank of Iceland where I said, "Can I send you some euros?" And they wrote back to me and they said, emailed back and said, "No, we're in danger of going bust." And of course they did. So in fairness to the Icelandic Central Bank, they were very honest to me, which I greatly appreciate. But for my sons and my daughter, I keep that email because it's a piece of history, and it was a seminal moment in the recession. But at that point in time, I thought, Christ, how on earth are these people going to live? How on earth are they going to function? So at one stage, before we found a little loophole of how to get money to them, I was literally getting suitcases full of cash, hard currency, to go over there and transact with them. Otherwise, my supply line would have been, that's it, finished. I just wouldn't be able to purchase anything from them, and all the disastrous consequences that would be for me. So in the end, we found someone in Denmark. Denmark was their former colonial, Iceland was the colony to Denmark. We found someone in Denmark who'd been stuck with a lot of Icelandic kroner, and I think his great delight, we came along and actually said, we want some of that useless, worthless bit of paper so we can exchange for proper goods and services back in Iceland. But I've got to say, it's a salutary lesson to all of us, the experience of Iceland. Not many, I don't think it's it's a story that's been told around the world, but their government refuses to acknowledge the liabilities that it has, and it's supporting all these companies in an insolvent state, and they can't correct, and they can't come back and start trading properly, which is a tragedy. I think once the bubbles burst, that's it. You've got to wash your hands and get on with life. But anyway, some other observations. That's the Iceland story. Some other observations that have been very useful to me is I'm told that there's an output gap, and I'm told that there's a liquidity trap, and these things perplex me tremendously. The output gap is when economists, you probably all know this, when economists say that because we've gone down so much, that we can go up a lot GDP-wise before there's any inflationary pressures. I think this is a standard mainstream way of viewing things, and that's how they justify being able to print untold sums of money into the economy, because allegedly we're going to rock along and use up all our excess capacity, and there'll be no inflationary effect. I can absolutely promise you 100% that in my business, I've never ever seen such a change in consumption patterns. Consumption patterns away from luxury end or upper to middle luxury end to regular goods and services. So in terms of the products that I'm producing today to satisfy demand of my customers, they're entirely different to that which I was producing before the Lehman's collapse. So there's no output gap at all in my productive capabilities, because I'm producing now something different to suit the needs and requirements and demands of the people, of the customers' needs now, which are different than they were pre-recession. And I think this is the case whenever I talk to any business people across the economy, that this is the case. Things have fundamentally changed, and none of us will have surplus capacity around us of plant machinery and kits and tools and whatever to make things that will just suddenly allow us to absorb all this money. So unfortunately, I see a great degree of inflation coming in the future. I see a great tsunami of inflation coming in the future, and I think that's actually the bottom line of what the policymakers want to happen, because there is no other way out for them. They won't liquidize or liquidate assets. They won't let the corrective process happen in the marketplace. They'll actually continue just to inflate their way out of it. Myself on banks, I just think I better say my bit about banks. In up to 2008, I was a golden boy of the banks, and you used to be able to phone them up and get anything you want, money-wise. From 2008 onwards, all of a sudden, no matter how profitable you were a danger to the bank. They no longer wish to have you. I had the unfortunate experience of having to try and rebank my business in 2008 January, and I've got to say, I thought, and we are fortunately a very profitable company. I thought it would be impossible to get rebanked, and in the end, we managed to persuade them. Of course, they charged their pound of flesh, and we're now, I think, paying 100% more in terms of our borrowings than we were before. And interestingly, we, the taxpayer, the British taxpayer, we've put these, again, just mythical sums of money into propping up these banks, and they're meant to be lending it out to private sector businesses. On July the 31st, I bought a business that was doing £15 million turnover. It had lost in the last year £2.4 million. I was paying not one single penny for it. I was taking the turnover and putting the turnover into my various factories, and it would produce £1.8 million extra profit onto the bottom line. The consideration for the vendors was the debtor book. I would collect out for them and give them the money. So no money needed to be raised for this transaction, no money at all, and it was the most no-brainer deal that has ever been presented to me in my whole life. And it was turned down. I failed my first credit committee that I've ever failed in 18 years of business at the Royal Bank of Scotland, even when I'm not asking for any money. They turned it down. I have to go to credit committee because under the terms of our banking covenants, any acquisitions we do, you have to get their permission. But we were turned down, and I thought to myself, Christ alive, if this is what's happening to me, what's happening to the businesses out there. In the end, we did do the deal. We managed to get some of the senior members of the Royal Bank of Scotland to agree to let the transaction pass. But it's a sorry state. Those banks have moved from being, captains of the universe to being zombie banks, to now being departments of the state. And I don't know how. I don't quite see how it's going to work its way out. But anyway, I think, just in conclusion and summing up, I think anyone in business would do well to heed the words of the Austrian theory of the business cycle. They'd do very well to understand the key money supply metrics in their country, because these are all things that can help you prevent yourself from being blown away in a recession. And I'm just delighted that in 2005 I tapped in, or 1997 I tapped in the words Ludwig von Mises to the internet, and up came the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and that put my thinking over a period of time. It took a little bit of time for me to get comfortable with what they were saying, but put my thinking very, very straight, of which I'm grateful. I see Lou standing there in the background there. I'm very grateful for his all the work he's done. But it certainly kept me on the straight and narrow during the recession, and I hope that if any of you are in business, you might have gained something useful out of my talk here today. Thank you very much.